Are you sure this is the right place? Derek asked, staring up at the imposing structure before them. The old library stood as a monument to a time long forgotten, its stone walls covered in ivy and its tall, narrow windows clouded with years of dust and grime. Yeah, this is it, Mark replied, clutching the crumpled piece of paper in his hand. The professor said this library has all the old records we need for the project. Besides, it's the only one around here that's old enough. As they pushed open the heavy wooden door, it creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the vast, dimly lit interior. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and musty leather, a stale, suffocating aroma that made Derek wrinkle his nose. Rows of tall, shadowy bookshelves stretched out before them, forming a labyrinth of knowledge long buried and forgotten. The only source of light came from a few flickering wall sconces, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The ceiling seemed impossibly high, lost in darkness, as though the library extended upwards into oblivion. A cold shiver ran down Derek's spine, and he exchanged a nervous glance with Mark. "Let's just find what we need and get out of here," Derek muttered. "Agreed," Mark said, though there was an undeniable excitement in his voice. He was always the curious one, eager to uncover secrets buried by time. They walked deeper into the library, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick, faded carpet that lined the floor. Occasionally the floorboards would creak under their weight, the sound like a whispered warning, urging them to turn back. But they pressed on, driven by the looming deadline of their project and an inexplicable pull toward the unknown. As they ventured further, they noticed the library seemed larger on the inside than it had from the outside. The rows of bookshelves seemed endless, stretching into the darkness with no end in sight. The air grew colder, the chill gnawing at their skin as they approached the heart of the library. "There's something off about this place," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't respond, his attention drawn to an ancient tome lying open on a reading table nearby. The book looked like it hadn't been touched in years, the pages yellowed with age. The text was in a language neither of them recognized, the letters twisted and contorted into strange, almost unnatural shapes. "What do you think this is?" Mark asked, his fingers hovering over the brittle pages. "Let's not mess with it," Derek replied, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "We're here for the records, not some weird old book." Mark reluctantly pulled his hand back, and they continued deeper into the library. The further they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. Finally, they reached a section marked Archives. The shelves here were filled with old ledgers, handwritten journals, and dusty scrolls, each one a relic of a time long past. The air was even colder here, and Derek could see his breath fogging in front of him. "Let's start looking," Mark said, though his voice now held a note of unease. They began sifting through the records, the brittle pages crumbling slightly under their touch. As they worked, a strange feeling settled over them, a sense of being watched. Derek glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness. After what felt like hours, Mark let out a triumphant noise. "Found something." He held up an old journal, the leather cover cracked and worn. The name Eleanor Cartwright was etched into the cover in faded gold lettering. "Who's that?" Derek asked. "Not sure," Mark replied, flipping through the pages. "But this journal seems to be from the late 1800s. Look, it mentions the library." Derek moved closer, reading over Mark's shoulder. The journal described Eleanor as the head librarian, a woman dedicated to preserving knowledge. But as they read further, the entries grew darker. Eleanor wrote about hearing voices in the library, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. She mentioned strange occurrences, the lights flickering, books falling from shelves, and cold spots that seemed to follow her. "This is creepy," Derek said, his unease growing. "There's more," Mark said, his voice hushed. "Listen to this. The whispers grow louder each night. They call my name, beckoning me to the archives. I fear I am losing my mind, but I cannot leave. The library will not let me." Derek felt a cold chill run down his spine. "We should go." Mark nodded, but his eyes were still glued to the journal. "Wait, there's something else. It's the last entry." Derek reluctantly stayed as Mark read aloud. "I've locked myself in the archives, but the whispers have found me. They tell me the truth, that I belong to the library, that I must stay here forever. I cannot escape. I will not leave. My fate is sealed." A loud crash echoed through the library, making them both jump. Derek's heart raced as he looked around, but there was no one in sight. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice shaking. Now. As they hurried back the way they came, the oppressive feeling intensified. The shadows seemed to reach out towards them, and the temperature dropped even further. Derek felt as though something was following them, an unseen presence lurking just beyond the edge of the light. They turned a corner, and Derek froze. Standing at the end of the aisle was a figure, a woman dressed in an old-fashioned librarian's uniform. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and her eyes were dark, hollow voids. She held a finger to her lips in a gesture for silence, and then she smiled, a cold, unnatural smile that sent a wave of terror through him. Mark grabbed Derek's arm and pulled him in the opposite direction, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they ran. The library seemed to twist and warp around them, the aisles rearranging themselves, trapping them in a maze of bookshelves and darkness. "This way," Mark shouted, spotting a door ahead. They burst through the door and into a small reading room. The door slammed shut behind them, and they leaned against it, panting. The room was dimly lit, with only a single flickering lamp on a table. The walls were lined with old portraits of stern-looking individuals, their eyes seeming to follow the two friends. "We need to find another way out," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek nodded, but his attention was drawn to one of the portraits. It was a painting of a woman, the same woman they had just seen in the library. Beneath the portrait, a plaque read, "Eleanor Cartwright, Head Librarian, 1879 to 1896. "That's her," Derek said, pointing to the portrait. "That's the librarian." Mark paled as he looked at the painting. "But how is that possible? She died over 100 years ago." Before Derek could respond, the door to the reading room creaked open. Slowly, deliberately, the figure of Eleanor Cartwright stood in the doorway, her hollow eyes fixed on them. She stepped into the room, her movements unnaturally smooth, as though she were gliding across the floor. Mark grabbed a heavy book from the table and hurled it at her, but it passed through her as though she were made of smoke. The librarian didn't even flinch. "We have to get out of here," Derek shouted, his voice cracking with fear. They scrambled to the other side of the room, searching for another exit, but there was none. The windows were boarded up, and the walls seemed to close in on them. Eleanor Cartwright moved closer, her presence suffocating, the temperature dropping to an unbearable cold. Derek could barely breathe, his lungs burning from the frigid air. "Why can't we leave?" Mark cried, panic overtaking him. The librarian finally spoke, her voice a low, echoing whisper that reverberated through the room. "The library does not let anyone leave." With those words, the room seemed to implode, the walls closing in, the darkness swallowing them whole. Derek felt the cold seep into his bones, freezing him in place as the librarian reached out with a skeletal hand. Her touch was like ice, and he felt his consciousness slipping away, his vision darkening. The last thing he heard was the whisper of Eleanor Cartwright, repeating the same words over and over. "You belong to the library. Forever."